I will cross the galaxy for you.
We must stand together against them.
No matter what happens, I am yours.
The alien princess was amazed. Her husband is a human warrior. The arrangement princess Vey'Thalis Korr of the Cthulhu Dominion had been married for 6 days, and in that time she had learned exactly 3 things about her human husband. He snored when he slept on his back. He apologized to furniture when he bumped into it. And he had not once, not even glancingly, mentioned the war that had ended only 4 years ago. The war his species had won against an armada 11 times its size. The marriage was political, of course. Everything between Earth and the Dominion was political now, after the Reclamation War, when humanity had turned the tables on 3 different alien coalitions that had tried to carve up the solar system. The surviving powers had scrambled to do anything except fight them again. The Cthulhu, who were proud, ancient, and, privately, Vey'Thalis would admit, terrified, had offered the oldest gesture in the Galactic playbook, a marriage alliance. Royal blood bound to military blood. A human soldier, decorated and dangerous, given a Cthulhu princess as both honor and hostage. She had expected a monster. The propaganda back home called humans the endless tide, the gray wolves, the species that did not know when to stop dying long enough to win. She had braced herself for someone broad and cold and proud, a living weapon who would treat her as a prize claimed in some unspoken continuation of the war. Instead, she had gotten Daniel Reyes, who currently sat cross-legged on the floor of their shared quarters aboard the Dominion flagship Vey'Thalis, trying to fix a broken food synthesizer with a multi-tool because he didn't want to bother the maintenance crew over something so small. "You are a war hero," she said, watching him from the doorway, arms crossed in the posture her tutors had drilled into her since childhood. Regal, unreadable, a queen's daughter giving nothing away. "You commanded a battalion at the siege of Kessandra Station. You personally accounted for the destruction of 2 capital ships, and you are currently lying on your back under a kitchen appliance." "Yeah, well," Daniel said, not looking up. "The appliance doesn't know I'm a war hero. It just knows it's broken." A spark crackled. He flinched. Also, ow. That was the maddening part. 6 days, and she still could not predict what he would say, what he would do, what would make him laugh, that quiet, huffing laugh of his. The Dominion's intelligence reports on humanity were thick as a moon's worth of rock, full of casualty figures and tactical analyses and grim assessments of human resolve. And none of it had prepared her for a man who said sorry to a cabinet. "You could simply requisition a new synthesizer," she said. Could. He finally slid out from under the unit, sat up, wiped his hands on his trousers. "But where's the fun in that?" "Fun." She turned the word over like a foreign coin. The Cthulhu did not generally use words like fun in reference to manual labor. Manual labor was for the unranked. She was a princess. She had never in her life touched a tool more demanding than a stylus. "Show me," she said before she had decided to say it. Daniel looked up at her properly for the first time since she'd entered the room, surprise flickering across his face. And then, more startling still, something like pleasure. "Yeah?" He shifted over, made room on the floor beside him. "Come here, Your Highness. Let's see if we can't save this poor machine's life." She sat. Her formal robes were entirely the wrong garment for sitting on a floor, and she discovered this fact with great indignity, but she did not get up. Daniel handed her the multi-tool, guided her hand toward a cluster of wiring with the easy patience of a man who had apparently taught field repairs to soldiers half his age. "You're not what I expected," she admitted, 20 minutes later, when the synthesizer chimed back to life and produced a passable approximation of Cthulhu honey bread. "Good or bad?" "Unclear," she said, and meant it as truthfully as she had ever meant anything. He grinned. "I'll take it." The first crack in the icet was 3 weeks later that she began to understand what kind of warrior she had actually married. Not through anything he told her, because he told her almost nothing of the war, but through the reactions of everyone around him, they had traveled to the Joint Command Station orbiting Threnus IV, a neutral world where Dominion and human officers worked side by side in the uneasy machinery of the noob's peace. Vey'Thalis walked the station's corridors at Daniel's side, expecting, based on 6 weeks of marriage, pleasant nods, polite deference, the ordinary courtesy owed a war hero. What she got instead was something closer to reverence, and it unsettled her more than any battle report could have. A young human ensign, barely out of training by the look of her, froze mid-stride when she saw Daniel, then snapped to a salute so sharp it looked painful. "Colonel Reyes, sir, at ease, ensign. I'm not your CO anymore, you don't have to do that. Sorry, sir, I mean, Daniel, it's just." The young woman's eyes were wide, almost glassy. "My uncle was at Kessandra, 3rd Company. He said you went back. For the wounded, under fire. Twice." Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly, just for a moment, and then the easy warmth came back over his face like a curtain drawn. "Your uncle exaggerates. Tell him I said hello." The ensign saluted again and hurried off, practically glowing. Vey'Thalis waited until they had turned a corner before she spoke. "What happened at Kessandra Station?" "Old news," Daniel said, in a tone that closed the subject as efficiently as a vault door. She let it go, for the moment, but she did not forget, and over the following weeks the pattern repeated. A Dominion logistics officer, briefed by his own intelligence division, went pale and overly polite the moment he learned who Daniel was. A grizzled human master sergeant in the mess hall stood up from his table, walked the length of the room, and simply shook Daniel's hand without a word, eyes wet, before walking away again. A Cthulhu tactical advisor, reviewing old battle data with a junior officer, stopped mid-sentence when Daniel passed behind them and murmured something in low Cthulhu that Vey'Thalis only half caught, something about the one who would not retreat. She began quietly to read. The Dominion's classified files on the Reclamation War were extensive, and as a princess of the royal house, she had access most citizens did not. She requested the full record on the siege of Kessandra Station and read it alone, late at night, while Daniel slept in the next room, snoring, as always, when he lay on his back. What she found chilled something in her that she had not known could be chilled. Kessandra Station had been a human supply depot, undermanned and underdefended, caught in the path of a Cthulhu strike fleet during the 2nd year of the war, back when the Dominion had still believed total victory was a matter of months. 312 human personnel, half of them support staff and medical crew, against an assault force of nearly 4,000. The station's command structure had collapsed within the first hour. By every reasonable military calculation, it should have fallen within the day. It held for 11 days. Major Daniel Reyes, not yet a colonel then, had been the ranking surviving officer after the first 6 hours. The official record was clinical, bloodless, full of phrases like reorganized defensive perimeter and conducted successive extraction operations under direct fire. But Vey'Thalis read between those careful words and saw something else. A man who had refused, again and again, in the face of overwhelming force and absolute strategic logic, to abandon the wounded, the trapped, the dying, who had gone back into burning corridors not once or twice, as the ensign had said, but, by the survivor testimonies appended to the file, 7 times, each time pulling someone out. By the time relief forces broke the siege, Kessandra Station's defenders had taken losses of nearly 60%. The Cthulhu assault force had taken losses of 91%. She sat with the data for a long time, the cold blue light of the reader washing over her face, and she understood, finally, fully, what the rest of the station had understood the moment they'd seen him. This was not a man who fought because he was ordered to. This was not even a man who fought to win. Exactly. Not in the way Cthulhu military doctrine framed it, all clean lines of conquest and consolidation. This was a man who fought for people, for the ones beside him. And he would apparently keep fighting, past every rational threshold of self-preservation, for as long as there was one more person to save. She closed the file and went to stand in the doorway of their bedroom, watching him sleep, snoring softly, one arm flung across the pillow where she usually lay. He looked, in sleep, almost absurdly ordinary. A tired man in his 30s with a faint scar above one eyebrow and calluses on his hands from fixing things that didn't strictly need fixing. The one who would not retreat. She had married a legend without knowing it, and the legend apologized to furniture. I. The question, she did not bring it up directly. That was not the Cthulhu way, and besides, some part of her suspected that confronting him with his own history would only make him retreat further behind that easy, deflecting warmth. Instead, she waited for an opening, and one came 2 months later, during a diplomatic reception aboard the Vey'Thalis, the kind of glittering, exhausting affair where Dominion nobility and human officers circled each other in careful conversational orbits, testing the new piece for weak points. Daniel hated these events. She'd learned that much. He wore his dress uniform like it itched and drank exactly 1 glass of the ceremonial wine, slowly, to have something to do with his hands. It was Lord Administrator Vey'Thalis, old, sharp-eyed, a war faction holdout who had never reconciled himself to the alliance, who finally said aloud what others only murmured. "Tell me, Colonel," Vey'Thalis said, swirling his own glass with a politician's practiced disdain, "do you ever regret it? All those soldiers, human and Cthulhu both, who never came home because your kind refused to negotiate when negotiation was still possible. I am told the Dominion offered terms 3 times before Kessandra, generous terms. You held the line anyway. 11 days of dying that needn't have happened if your people had simply known when to yield." The reception room, which had been a low hum of conversation, went very quiet around them. Vey'Thalis felt her pulse spike, the old court instinct rising in her to intervene, smooth the moment over, redirect. But something held her still. She wanted, suddenly and fiercely, to hear the answer. Daniel set down his glass. He did not look angry. That was the strange part. She had expected anger, or at least the cold precision of a soldier reciting doctrine. Instead, his expression was almost gentle, the look of a man choosing his words the way he'd choose his footing on uncertain ground. "With respect, Lord Administrator," he said, "your fleet didn't offer terms to negotiate a peace. It offered terms to negotiate a surrender. There's a difference, and I think you know it." A pause. 312 people were on that station. Engineers, medics, 2 pregnant ensigns, a maintenance crew that hadn't drawn a weapon in their lives. Your terms would have let your fleet take the station intact and call the personnel detained pending processing. I read what processing meant for the Theban colony 8 months earlier. I wasn't going to find out what it meant for mine. Vey'Thalis's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "You're right that people died who might have lived if I'd surrendered," Daniel went on, quieter now. "I think about that. I think about it most nights, if I'm honest with you. But I think about something else too. The alternative version of those 11 days, the one where I open the doors and let your fleet walk in, and 312 people become however many ended up dead anyway. Except now they died believing I'd protect them, and I didn't even try." He shook his head slowly. "I'd rather carry the weight of the choice I made. At least it was mine to carry. At least I made it standing up." The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement. Exactly. Vey'Thalis' faction would never agree, not fully, not with a war so recently bled into their cultural memory. But it was the silence of something settling, some scale tipping that had been wavering since the war's end. Several of the human officers in the room were not bothering to hide their expressions, pride and grief tangled together. A few of the younger Cthulhu nobles were watching Daniel with the particular intensity of people, revising a long-held belief in real time. Vey'Thalis inclined his head. Not agreement, but acknowledgement, which from a man like him was its own kind of concession. "A soldier's answer," he said. "I expected one. I did not expect it to be a good one." "I'll take it," Daniel said, echoing, without meaning to, the words he'd said to her on the floor of their quarters 2 months before, over a broken synthesizer. Later that night, in the quiet of their rooms, Vey'Thalis sat across from him while he undid the high collar of his dress uniform with visible relief. "You never told me," she said. "Told you what?" "Any of it, Kessandra." "The terms you refused, the 11 days. She hesitated, then made herself continue, because she had decided somewhere over the past 2 months that whatever this marriage was becoming, it deserved honesty. "I read the files. I know what you did there. I know what it cost you." Daniel went still for a moment, collar half undone, and something moved behind his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Not quite pain, not quite weariness, something more complicated than either. "It's not really a story I tell at parties," he said finally. "People hear war hero and they want the highlight reel. They don't usually want the part where I still remember every name of everyone who didn't make it out. 63 names. I know all of them. I would want that part," she said, "if you ever wished to tell it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his posture eased, like a door unlatching that had been shut a long time. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think you might, actually." The peace, as all peace built on old wounds tends to be, was fragile. And 4 months into their marriage, it was tested in a way no diplomatic reception could have prepared either of them for. A splinter faction of the old war coalition, Khathun radicals who had never accepted the alliance, who saw the royal marriage as a humiliation rather than a healing, struck the joint command station at Threnis IV with a small but well-armed raiding force. Vey'Thalis and Daniel were aboard at the time, attending a routine logistics summit, and within minutes of the first explosion, the station's careful order dissolved into chaos. Alarms shrieking down every corridor, emergency bulkheads slamming shut, the comm channels flooding with overlapping, panicked traffic. Vey'Thalis had been trained for many things in her life as a princess. Diplomacy, court politics, the elegant art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. But not for this. Not for the floor shuddering under a secondary blast. Not for the acrid smell of scorched metal. Not for the particular terror of not knowing where the next explosion would land. Daniel changed in front of her eyes, and the change was immediate and total. The warm, easy, apologizes to furniture man vanished, and in his place was someone she had only read about in files. Calm in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with the mastery of it. He pulled her behind an emergency support column without seeming to think about it, his body angled instinctively to put himself between her and the corridor's mouth. "Stay low. Stay with me. Don't run unless I tell you to run," he said, voice flat and quick and utterly certain, and despite every instinct screaming at her to do something, anything, she found herself simply obeying. Because some ancient animal part of her recognized in that voice a person who knew exactly what he was doing. He commandeered 3 terrified human technicians and a pair of Dominion security officers within 90 seconds, organizing them with a few short sentences into something that functioned like a unit instead of a scattering of panicked people. He directed the wounded toward a defensible mess hall, sealed 2 compromised corridors using an emergency override he clearly should not have had the clearance for, and clearly did not care. And when the Raiders' advance team breached the station's lower ring, he was the one who met them. Not recklessly, not with the desperate fury Vey'Thalis half expected, but with the same terrible calm, picking his ground, using cover, conserving every motion. She watched him drop 2 armed raiders with a salvaged security sidearm at a range that should have been impossible, watched him drag a wounded Dominion guard. a member of a species he had been at war with 4 years prior, bodily out of a collapsing corridor without hesitation, watched him absorb a glancing plasma burn across his shoulder, and keep moving as though his body had simply filed the pain away to deal with later. It was, she realized with a strange, vertiginous clarity, exactly the man from the Kessandra files, not a story anymore, not a record in a classified archive. Here, now, real the raid lasted 40 minutes before station security, and a hastily scrambled response force broke it. 40 minutes that felt, to Vey'Thalis, like a lifetime compressed and then violently released. When it was over, when the last raider was subdued, the wounded were being carried to medical bays, the alarms finally quieting into the low hum of a station counting its costs. She found Daniel sitting against a bulkhead in the secured mess hall, shoulder bleeding through a hastily applied field dressing, looking utterly exhausted and, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely unguarded. She sat down beside him on the cold floor, the way she had sat beside him on the floor of their quarters all those months ago, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "You saved them," she finally said. "All of them. Human and Cthulhu both. You didn't even pause to consider which was which." "Didn't need to." He winced as he shifted his shoulder. "People in danger are just people in danger. Doesn't matter what they look like. That is not how my people think," she said quietly. "Not entirely. Not yet. Maybe not." He turned his head to look at her, and despite the blood and the exhaustion and the lingering adrenaline shake in his hands, he managed something like a smile. "But you're sitting here instead of running for the evac pods, Your Highness, and 4 months ago you'd have had a full security detail do that for you without thinking twice." Things change. People change. Maybe ways of thinking do too, eventually, if enough people decide to make it happen one stubborn choice at a time. She thought of Vox Kethrian's grudging respect at the reception. She thought of the ensign's reverent salute. She thought of 63 names that one man carried, so that no one else would have to. "I used to think humans fought because you did not know how to stop," she said. "I read it in every intelligence report we ever compiled. The endless tide. The species that simply would not yield, no matter the cost. And now? Now I think," she said slowly, working the thought out as she spoke it, the way she imagined he must do constantly, thinking with his hands and his actions instead of waiting for the perfect words, "that you do not fight because you cannot stop. I think you fight because you have decided, every single time, that the person beside you matters more than the cost of protecting them. That is not the absence of an ending point. That is a choice, made again and again, that simply looks like it has no ending point from the outside." Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before. Something unguarded, something that looked almost like wonder, as though she had handed him back a piece of himself he hadn't known how to articulate. "That's..." He huffed a tired laugh, the sound rough at the edges. "That's about the best summary of it anyone's ever given me. Including myself, I am observant," she said, with the faintest, exhausted echo of her old regal dryness. "It is, apparently, a princess's job." He laughed properly then, despite the burn on his shoulder, despite the wreckage around them, despite everything, and the sound of it, warm and real in the wake of all that violence, settled something in her chest that she hadn't known was unsettled. The amazement in the weeks that followed the attack on Threnus IV, something shifted. Not just between Vey'Thalis and Daniel, but across the wider fabric of the alliance itself. The story of the human colonel who had defended both species without distinction spread through the joint command structure with the particular speed reserved for stories people want to believe. Vox Kethrian's faction lost ground in the Dominion's inner council. A handful of skeptical human units who had grumbled about the political marriage as a costly piece of theater began speaking of Vey'Thalis with something warmer than mere courtesy, because word had gotten around that the princess had stood her ground beside Reyes instead of fleeing, that she had sat in the wreckage afterward and asked him real questions instead of performing royal gratitude for the cameras. But it was a quieter moment, months later, that crystallized for Vey'Thalis everything she had come to understand about her husband, and, in turn, about herself. It was an ordinary evening. Their quarters aboard the Vey'Thalis had by then become something genuinely shared rather than merely co-occupied. Her formal robes hung beside his uniforms, a half-finished repair project, a model ship he was building, of all things, from salvaged Dominion alloy scrap, just for the satisfaction of making something with his hands, sat on the table between two mismatched chairs. The synthesizer, long since fully repaired, hummed quietly in the corner. She found him sitting at that table, turning a small data chip over in his fingers, his expression distant. "What is it?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Kessandra reunion," he said. "Survivors do one every year. They sent the recording. Since I couldn't make it this time." He set the chip down, didn't reach for the reader. 63 names get read out every year. I usually watch alone. You do not have to watch alone any longer, she said. And it surprised her how simply true the words felt as she said them. Not a diplomatic courtesy, not a careful political phrase chosen for effect, but the plainest fact in the world. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, wordlessly, picked the chip back up and slotted it into the reader between them. They watched it together, a modest gathering of aged and aging veterans, human faces lined with years and grief and stubborn survival, reading 63 names into a quiet room while a candle burned at the center of a table. Vey'Thalis watched her husband's face as each name was spoken, watched the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at certain names. The ones she would later learn, that belonged to people he had personally tried and failed to save in those final desperate moments before the relief fleet broke the siege. When the recording ended, neither of them spoke for a while. "I am amazed by you," she finally said, breaking the silence, and the words felt larger leaving her mouth than she had intended them to. "Not by the battles, not by the victories your intelligence files catalog so neatly. I am amazed that a man who has carried 63 names for 4 years, who bears that weight every single day and will likely bear it every day for the rest of his life, still gets down on the floor to fix a kitchen appliance because he does not want to trouble the maintenance crew. Still apologizes to furniture. Still finds something worth laughing about most days. Despite everything." She reached across the table and took his hand, calloused and scarred and steady. "On Khathun, we measure greatness by conquest, by what is taken and held. I think I finally understand that you measure it by what you refuse to let go of. And somehow, despite everything that should have hardened you into something cold, you have remained someone capable of kindness. I do not think I understood, before I met you, that those two things could exist in the same person. The warrior and the kindness. I thought one had to consume the other eventually." Daniel turned his hand in hers, threading their fingers together, and for once he did not deflect with humor, did not turn the moment lighter than it wanted to be. "I think," he said slowly, "that's the only way to carry it, honestly. If I let the war turn me into something that couldn't fix a broken synthesizer or laugh at a bad joke anymore, then whatever those 63 people died trying to protect, whatever all of it was for, would have been lost anyway. Just slower. I figure the least I owe them is staying someone worth having survived for." Vey'Thalis, princess of the Khathun Dominion, daughter of an ancient and proud lineage that had spent generations cataloging the supposed savagery of the human species, found that she had no court-trained words left for this moment, only the plain truth of what she felt, offered without artifice for perhaps the first time in her royal life. "Then I am glad," she said softly, "beyond anything I have words for, that I was given to a man who decided that. Outside the viewport, the slow churn of stars wheeled past in the comfortable, indifferent dark, the same stars that had watched a fleet burn at Kessandra Station. The same stars that would watch whatever came next for the fragile, hard-won peace between their two peoples. But in that small shared room, amid a half-built model ship and a humming synthesizer and a list of 63 names finally shared instead of carried alone, something far more permanent than any treaty had quietly, irrevocably taken root. Not an alliance of convenience. Not a marriage of political necessity. Something that, against every cynical expectation either of their peoples had carried into this arrangement, had simply, stubbornly, become love, built the same way Daniel built everything that mattered, one patient, deliberate choice at a time, refusing to retreat. And the princess, who had once expected a monster, understood at last that she had been amazed all along, not by a warrior's strength, but by the quiet, relentless decency that strength had been built to protect.